You can have it all is a fallacy. You can't have it all. My mother, when she came to America, had to immediately face that dilemma and face that dilemma over and over in her life, whether or not to stay with her children or whether or not to pursue her career. It so happens that the career was in Hollywood, and it so happens that my father was going to medical school in Rochester, New York, and I stayed with him. It was deemed that that would be best for me. My mother came to visit occasionally, but she spent most of her time in California. Eventually, we all went to California. We all lived in Beverly Hills. My mother then traveled and was away, and there was always this pull for her between how much time she could spend at home and how much time she was to spend on her art. So-called real family life was never as real to her as what was happening on a set. And the people she met on the sets, I think, became substitute family. And I think people on a set are a better substitute family sometimes than your own family, because I think very often the director is like the father figure, and maybe there's an older actress who becomes the mother figure, and then there are the brothers and sisters who are all the other actors. But those people never present as much a problem as your real mother and father and your real husband and your real children. My mother was deeply disappointed in the reception to Joan of Arc, as well as to some other movies she made in those years. She was becoming disillusioned with Hollywood, and her marriage to my father had become strained. This is when she first saw the work of Italian filmmaker Roberto Rossellini.
I happened to see a picture called Rome Open City, and it so struck me, it so moved me. It was the real feeling, and the people were real. And that wonderful human feeling came across the screen that was hard to find. I didn't think Mr. Rossellini would ever get enough courage to write to me, because I was, in those days, very high on top of the box office. He wouldn't possibly get the idea that I would like to come to Italy and make one of his little pictures, you know, for very little money. So I had to tell him that, and I didn't know how to do it except write a letter.
My mother had left home many times for other roles. Why should this be any different? But this time it would be years before she would return. Again, I remained with my father, who was then a neurosurgeon in Los Angeles. I was 10 years old. Ingrid Bergman arrived in Italy in 1949 to make a picture directed by Roberto Rossellini called Stromboli. But the movie itself paled into insignificance compared to the world scandal that would soon break.
We had a story outline, and then the dialogue was always written as we went along. My leading man was a fisherman, and he thought he was going to work in the crew. He had no idea that he was going to become my leading man. Mr. Rossellini didn't like actors, and he wanted real people. I said, you know, all the close-ups has to be from this side. And he said, are you out of your mind? I shoot my picture the way it suits me. I don't care which side of the face it's going to be on. And from then on, I threw it out of my mind.
And I think besides the great filmmaker, she discovered this great, generous man. And Mother has always been a little bit of a scared creature. You know, she was always very shy and a little bit scared of people, a little bit afraid of authority. She was very independent, but she, like a child, you know, like a child who would stand her ground but would not fight back. And Father came with his immense generosity, immense lightness. You know, the world was out there for him to enjoy. You know, and I think she came from a Swedish background that taught her the world is out there for you to obey, to bow, to be respectful. My father never thought of that. In fact, it was even considered unrespectful. Not that I consider him unrespectful, but there were no rules for him. It was life, you know. I thought he brought her so much optimism, so much vitality, and a great sense of adventure.
but it was a marvelous way of getting away from everything that I wanted to get away from, and that was all the ease. Here was nothing that was easy. In Hollywood in those days was like a dream. If you wanted pink elephants, you'd get pink elephants, or you get trained flies or anything. Call up and we get them for tomorrow. And all the talent was there, and an enormous amount of people in the crew, and I was very spoiled, which was the complete difference when you came to Italy and you did everything yourself, and in a very, very hard way. But that is what I wanted, and I got what I wanted.
You know, in 1949, my mother fell in love with my dad, and she was married still to Peter. That created an enormous scandal, and then to make it worse, you know, a few months later she got pregnant. She wasn't married, and she wasn't even divorced from Peter. That created a scandal that was of epic dimension.
I certainly thought that there would be some write-ups in the paper that I wanted a divorce, but I certainly didn't expect for months and years to be headlines and on the first page.
When she had a child with Roberto Rossellini and she wasn't married to him, why it was such a scandal and disaster. If it had been one of the actresses, maybe who'd always played the bad girl, they would have said that's right in character. Because Ingrid Bergman was so convincing on screen as virtuous, submissive, and self-sacrificing, her off-screen behavior was a shock. Her former admirers felt duped and betrayed.
So many people tried to tell me that it was their enormous love for me, that their love turned to hatred because my image was the good, wonderful woman who had played, but they forgot that played, a saint and a nun. They forgot that I was a woman and maybe not at all what I did on the screen.
My mother stayed on in Italy with Roberto Rossellini after she made Stromboli. She was denounced in Congress by a United States senator who declared her persona non grata. My father and I lived in California with the enormous public outcry. After strange legal maneuverings, my mother received a Mexican divorce and a Mexican marriage, with stand-ins acting for herself and Roberto Rossellini. My father won custody of me in Los Angeles, with my cooperation. He was desperate. I felt I was all he had left. Meanwhile, in Italy, my mother's family was growing. In 1950, Robertino was born. 2 years later, my mother gave birth to twin girls, Isabella and Ingrid. You know, when you're a child, you think that it's like a story. You think everybody has control and they can make up their mind about their destiny and say, well, you did this wrong and you did this right and I... Yeah, but life isn't like that. As you get older, particularly after you have your own children, then you become able to say, oh, it's more complicated. Now I begin to understand. Now I understand why marriages fail. Now I understand why people don't get along with their children. Now I understand why there are absences or there are presents or there are difficulties. As a child, you can't see that.
It didn't hurt me, that the fact that my mother wasn't there every day. In fact, I kind of liked it because I was very noisy. And when Mother and Father were at home, they always told us to shut up because they were on the phone or they were reading something. So when they were gone, the house was mine. I could make as much noise as I wanted. So I didn't mind them coming and going because I liked their affection and I never felt that I wasn't loved. I think it had been a little bit hard on my sister Ingrid, who maybe has a little bit of Mother's character. She's a little more shy. And I think it had been very hard for Pia, who was prevented to see her for years because of the divorce with Peter. But I was a kind of a bulldog, so I really didn't need their presence every day. When I was about 12 or 13-year-old, that found out that I had a deformity on the spine called the scoliosis that needed to be operated. And at the time, it was a major operation, and I'd been in a cast and immobilized in bed. I was sick for about 2 years, of which a year and a half in a cast. And my mother stopped working and was at my side all the time. My father was a total avant-garde artist. The only thing that interested him was to forward a media. Instead, for my mother was, if you want, more the establishment, but by that I don't mean anything negative, more take a theme and develop it until you master it.
No, if I went back home, I would save neither myself nor the others.
But the avant-garde thing, it's a hard way of life. So there's no money, there is always danger, there is always bad reviews. And I think she could not sustain the kind of attack that came not only with the scandal, but even with the unsuccessful films that they had done.
Only when you're completely free are you at peace with the community. Those who are bound to nothing are bound to everybody.
When Roberto was having a particularly difficult time raising money for a new film, he decided to direct Ingrid in a touring production of Honegger's Joan of Arc at the Stake. The entire Rossellini family toured the capitals of Europe. The project was not a financial success. For years, Roberto had been very possessive. He refused to consider that Ingrid might work with another director. Finally, he did agree, and my mother went to France to make Paris Does Strange Things with director Jean Renoir. But the picture that was to return Ingrid to triumph and eventually back to America was yet to come. Anastasia.